You're just street trash. You'll never amount to anything." The words were spoken with such profound contempt that they seemed to pierce the air, cutting through everything around them with the coldness of a sharp blade. The boy felt the impact of each syllable, as if each one had been etched into his soul, like a mark he could never erase. He, who had grown accustomed to being invisible, to being treated like a disposable object, now felt humiliation like never before. That man's gaze wasn't just one of contempt, but of definitive condemnation, as if he were something beneath everyone else, something unworthy of even the chance to exist. He, with his dirty feet and torn clothes, seemed the perfect reflection of society's indifference. Street trash, he thought. That was how everyone saw him. Deep down, he knew that that sentence, with all its cruelty, would be the last thing he would hear. Not because he would give up, but because, in that moment, the weight of the words would push him toward something no one expected. Something that would change everything. But what no one knew at the time was that those words, spoken with such contempt, would be what would drive him to face his destiny in a way no one could ever imagine. The boy, who until then had lived on the margins, with nothing but the emptiness of rejection, felt something shift within him. The pain of humiliation didn't break him as he imagined. Instead, it lit a flame within him, a flame he'd never known before, but which was now growing stronger. He looked at the ground, the man's words still echoing in his mind, but instead of feeling defeated, he felt a strength coming from deep within. Something inside him was awakening. He didn't know what he would do with it, didn't know how, but he was determined to no longer be street trash. He was determined to show everyone, and especially himself, that there was something more to him, that he still had a chance, and that this humiliation would be just the beginning of the greatest transformation of his life. The boy didn't know it yet, but that contempt would be the key to his overcoming. Something was about to happen, something that would change the course of his life in unthinkable ways. He was about to become the hero of his own story. It was on that cold, silent night that the humiliation still echoed in his mind, but, contrary to what he imagined, it didn't turn into weakness. He, who had so often looked up at the stars without hope, now felt an inexplicable strength growing within him. The streets, which had always been his home, seemed different that night. The boy, with tired eyes and a bruised soul, looked to the horizon and realized, for the first time, that something was about to change. The humiliation, which had seemed like an emotional death sentence, now seemed to be the force driving him toward something greater. He never forgot the moment those cruel words were hurled at him, but now they no longer defined who he was. The pain of abandonment and indifference was still there, but something inside him told him he couldn't accept being invisible anymore. He wasn't just another boy lost on the city streets. He had something inside him, a strength he couldn't explain, but it was about to manifest. He knew that to change, he would have to start from the inside out. The humiliation was a wound, but he also knew it was the opportunity he'd been searching for. He could have taken the easy path of giving up, like so many others before him, but a part of him, an unknown part, drove him to keep going, to fight for something he didn't know what it was, but which now seemed to be the only thing that mattered. With each passing day, the streets became more of a challenge, but also a training ground. The boy became stronger, not physically, but emotionally. He learned to see the world differently, to perceive opportunities where before he saw only pain and suffering. And, little by little, he moved away from the shadow of humiliation that so haunted him. The boy didn't know that, at that very moment, something much bigger was about to happen, something that would place him in a situation where he would have to become more than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just surviving the streets and the cruel words. He was preparing to save his own life and, perhaps, save something even greater than he imagined. The tragedy that was coming would change everything, and he would have the chance to show everyone that he was not street trash. He was much more than that. The following days were a mixture of loneliness and despair. The boy still felt the weight of those cruel words, but there was something different in his gaze. He was no longer the same. What had seemed like an unbearable weight now drove him forward. Each step through the dirty, icy city streets felt heavier, as if every pothole in the asphalt was a reminder of his own struggle. But no matter how hard it was, he refused to turn back. The words still echoed, but now he treated them like fuel. If he were to be invisible, it would be his invisibility that would protect him. He didn't remember how he got there, lost among the city's alleys and lanes, but he knew there was no turning back. The city, with its tall buildings and bright lights, seemed so far removed from his reality. As people hurried past, oblivious to his presence, the boy wondered how he could ever change his situation. How could he escape this endless cycle of humiliation and abandonment? But, as difficult as it was, he began to realize he had something others didn't: time. Time to observe, time to learn to survive. He knew that each day he spent on the streets made him more resilient, more prepared. The looks of disgust, the cruel words, and the gestures of indifference were just part of the picture. He knew he had to stand his ground, not for them, but for himself. Something inside him told him he would no longer be a victim of life. He remembered the words, every insult, and now he saw them differently. He would no longer be that weak boy who allowed himself to be defined by the world's cruelty. He knew the only way to change his story was to take control of it. Over time, he began to distance himself from the immediate suffering, and something deeper began to emerge within him. It wasn't a revolt against the world, but a quiet determination. The boy learned to see the streets no longer as a prison, but as a training ground. Each challenge, each obstacle, made him stronger. He knew that to change his destiny, he would have to fight with the weapons life had given him. And those streets, with all their violence and desolation, were now what he needed to become more than he was. He began to see himself as someone capable of changing his own future. The difficulties were still many, and the struggle for daily survival didn't diminish. Hunger, cold, loneliness, all these factors were present, but now he faced them with a different mindset. He no longer feared the challenges. He knew that, in the end, if he could survive in that unforgiving landscape, he could survive anything. He just needed to take the next step, always forward, never back. The contempt that had so affected him no longer affected him as before. He understood that, to those who never saw him, never recognized him, he was invisible. But he also knew that invisibility could be his greatest strength. He didn't need to be seen to be great. He didn't need anyone's approval to prove his strength. He was beginning to understand the value of his journey and the power that lay within him, waiting to be unleashed. The humiliating words that had once paralyzed him were now just the beginning of a transformation no one expected. The boy was about to become someone who, no matter how hard the world tried to erase him, could not be forgotten. What he didn't yet know was that the opportunity to show his true strength was about to arise in a way he had never imagined. But to do so, he would have to overcome even more obstacles, face his greatest fears, and finally discover what lay in store for him in this seemingly cruel destiny. The boy, who until then had taken refuge in the shadows of the city, now began to face his fears head-on. The loneliness that had once consumed him now seemed like a silent companion, teaching him how to survive but simultaneously preventing him from taking the next step. He knew that to achieve something greater, he needed to challenge himself, but every time he tried to reach out to others, a feeling of insecurity overcame him. The cruel words still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that, in the eyes of many, he was still seen as worthless. That's when he began to question himself. Will I always be this person, someone living on the margins, someone without a place in this world? The daily struggle wasn't just for physical survival, but also for finding his worth. Every time he saw someone passing by and felt their indifferent glances, the wound inside him reopened, as if he could never free himself from the pain of contempt. But try as he might, he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in an emotional prison, where no one saw him, where he didn't matter. Over time, he began to realize that the hardest battle wasn't against others, but against himself. He had become a spectator in his own life, afraid to live fully because of the ghosts of his past. He began to wonder if he would ever be able to free himself from this shadow of humiliation. The pain of being invisible, the pain of not being accepted, seemed like something he would have to live with forever. But something deep within his soul was beginning to awaken. With each day of struggle, of facing rejection, a part of him was reborn. He didn't yet know what this meant, but he felt he was about to discover something within himself he'd never realized. He still felt the wounds of the past, but instead of surrendering to them, he began to learn to use them. Every scornful look, every sarcastic laugh, every cruel word now began to lose their power. He saw them not as defeats, but as reminders that he was, in fact, alive. It was then that the city, with its tall buildings and busy streets, which had previously seemed unattainable, began to become a realm of possibilities. He noticed that, although most people ignored him, some looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. There was no true compassion, but there was a kind of silent recognition. He, who had previously believed himself invisible, now understood that he possessed something no one could take away: his willpower. Even without a voice, even without a place, he had become someone who could not be ignored. The feeling of helplessness was still a shadow, but he began to see that he could rise from the ashes. He was learning to be more than the image society had created for him. Little by little, he moved away from the idea that he was just street trash. He knew that change had to come from within. What the world did to him no longer held as much power. What he did to himself, now, was what mattered. He began to realize that the greatest obstacle to overcome was his own belief that he was incapable. For so long, he had convinced himself that he was a failure, that he deserved nothing more. But each step he took toward his own transformation was a victory over that belief. He now began to look at life with a new perspective, understanding that even in the worst conditions, he could find strength. And this strength, which lay in simple gestures, in resisting humiliation, in rising after each fall, began to shape him in ways he could no longer ignore. The boy, who had previously wandered the streets aimlessly, now walked with greater purpose, certain that he had the power to change his life. And, unbeknownst to him, he was preparing for what was to come. A tragedy he couldn't yet imagine was about to test him in ways no one could have predicted. And it would be this moment, more than any other, that would reveal the true strength he was building within himself. This section further develops the protagonist's inner journey, showing how he begins to free himself from the emotional limitations imposed by the humiliation and obstacles he faces in life. He's transforming, and this sets the stage for the big revelation that follows. If you need further guidance or want to move on to the next phase, I'm here to help. One morning, like so many others, the boy woke to a light breeze of icy wind touching his face. The city, with its frenetic rhythms, was already in full motion, while he stood there, in his corner, watching others pass by. But that day, something different hung in the air. The city was more agitated, more tense, as if something imminent were about to happen. He felt a vibration in the earth. At first, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, but it soon intensified. The sky, once clear, was shrouded in dark clouds, and the wind, once chilly, now seemed to carry something else. The boy, accustomed to living in a constant state of alert, felt goosebumps crawl. He knew something was wrong, that the city was about to be overtaken by a force far greater than he could comprehend. Suddenly, the sound of sirens began to echo through the streets, a desperate scream that cut through the tranquility of the day. People began to run in all directions, the streets filled with panic. The boy tried to understand what was happening, but everything seemed to be moving so fast, so out of control. Until he looked to the horizon and saw a huge cloud of smoke was rising from the city center, followed by a thick mass of flames. A massive fire was engulfing a commercial building, the fire spreading with frightening speed, engulfing everything in its path. The boy knew many were inside, many of whom he saw daily, people who lived comfortable lives while he struggled to survive. But in that moment, all social distinctions seemed to disappear. The fire made no distinction between who was there. Despair gripped the entire city, but the boy didn't hesitate. He, who had been invisible for so long, now knew he had something to offer. Something inside him awakened with complete clarity. He saw the others running, fleeing from danger, and it was at that moment that he realized he could no longer hide. He could no longer be a mere witness, no longer wait for help that might never come. He had to act. The boy ran toward the fire, driven by a force he barely understood. He knew he was untrained, that he was no hero. But he also knew that no one else would dare do what he was about to do. As he approached the burning building, the heat became unbearable, and the smoke seeped into his lungs, making it difficult to breathe. But he didn't stop. At the top of the building, he could see people trapped, banging on the windows and screaming for help. The boy knew he didn't have much time. He ran up the stairs, feeling the ground shake with each burst of fire. He didn't know how, but he was determined to do something, to save someone. And then he saw him. One of the men who had previously humiliated him. The same man who had called him street trash was there, trapped, struggling to get out of one of the offices on the top floor. The boy paused for a moment, his heart racing. Past and present collided in that instant. The man, with desperate eyes, finally saw him, and in that look was something he never imagined he would see: fear. The man stood there, completely helpless, in need of help. The decision was instantaneous. The boy ran to the man, feeling the weight of the words that had devastated him in the past, but he didn't hesitate. He reached out to him, not because he wanted revenge or to prove anything to anyone, but because, in that moment, he knew that saving a life was more important than any insult he had received. The boy, now stronger and more determined, helped the man out of the flames, carrying him to a safer place where rescuers could rescue him. The town, which had previously ignored the boy, now watched in disbelief. The street trash had become the unexpected hero, the only one capable of saving someone when everyone else was fleeing. And although the man had been rescued, the real rescue was happening within himself. He, who had been despised and humiliated, was now showing the world his true strength. No one could have imagined what would happen next. The boy, still breathing heavily from the smoke, felt something grow inside him, something he could never have imagined. He had changed, not just by saving someone, but by being able to do the unthinkable without hesitation, without fear. He had finally found his purpose. The boy, his heart racing now and his lungs still heavy with smoke, observed the chaos around him. The fire continued to ravage the building, and time was running out. But something inside him was different. He felt a strength he never knew he possessed. The man he had rescued was safe, but the tragedy was not over yet. He looked around, seeing people panicking, trying to escape the fire, unsure of what to do, lacking the courage to act. But he, who had always been invisible, was now seen, not as a victim, but as someone who could make a difference. The boy knew that rescuing one person wouldn't be enough. He had to do more, much more. He couldn't stop there. The flames were spreading, and other lives were in danger, lives he never imagined he could save. The fear that had paralyzed him for so long now fueled his action. He was no longer terrified. He was determined to act, to save as many people as possible, especially those who, like himself, were in a state of utter vulnerability. He knew he couldn't do it alone, but his courage had transformed into something much greater. As panic gripped everyone, the boy ran back to the burning building, ignoring the firefighters' orders and the chaos around him. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew he had to try. The city, with its indifference, was now gripped by tragedy, and he was one of the few people willing to fight. He felt that by doing so, he was not only saving other people's lives, but his own as well. Every step he took toward the fire was a step toward leaving behind the fear and pain of his previous life. As he approached the building again, he saw more people trapped in the windows, more screams of despair. His eyes, once blinded by pain and humiliation, were now open, fixed on the task before him. He no longer felt the sting of the words that had once destroyed him. The words of contempt now seemed small compared to the reality he was facing. He was no longer that weak, worthless boy. He was someone who could change the course of things, someone who had the power to save lives, someone who would not let fear paralyze him. With trembling hands, he approached the upper-story window where a woman and her daughter were trapped, screaming for help. He saw them, as desperate as he had been, as fragile and helpless as he had felt in the darkest days of his life. But now he was different. He knew what to do. He didn't hesitate. He climbed, with the help of a piece of wood he found along the way, to the floor where the two were trapped. They were terrified, but when they saw that boy, that street trash, whom they probably would never have noticed before, a glimmer of hope lit their eyes. The boy, with a strength he didn't know he possessed, helped them out through the windows, guiding them to a safer spot where the firefighters could catch them. With each movement, he felt adrenaline coursing through his body, the same adrenaline that made him overcome his own limitations, the same adrenaline that made him understand, right then and there, that he was no longer a shadow, but someone capable of making a difference. When he finally handed them over to the rescuers, the woman and her daughter, crying, thanked him with tears in their eyes. But the boy didn't feel proud. He didn't need the words of thanks, because deep inside he knew that what he did was more than saving lives. He was saving himself. He was no longer that invisible boy, the street trash. He was a hero. He walked away silently, not expecting recognition. He didn't need it. What he had done was something far greater than any material reward. He had transformed from victim to hero, and that was all he ever needed to prove to himself. The fire hadn't gone out, but the boy had found his own inner flame. He didn't know what the future held, but now he knew that, no matter what, he had something immeasurable within him, courage. The fear that had once dominated him was now his motivation. He knew this transformation wouldn't end there. The world might continue to ignore him, but he was no longer the same. He had left the past behind, and with it, all the cruel words. Now he understood something he'd never known, that saving someone, making a difference, didn't mean becoming something others saw. It meant being who he truly was, even if no one else believed it. Chaos continued to spread through the city, but the boy was now more aware than ever of the responsibility he bore. He didn't know if he could save everyone, but he knew he couldn't stop. The fire was still ravaging the building, and the firefighters were overwhelmed. Panic spread as more people became trapped, some, like him, unsure of where to run. The boy, now with unwavering determination, continued to move through the flames and thick smoke. Every life he helped save, every moment he spent facing danger, seemed to further cement his belief that he was exactly where he needed to be. That's when he heard screams coming from a higher floor. The building, already several parts compromised, began to slowly collapse. The boy, now aware of his own strength, didn't hesitate. He knew he had only seconds left, but he couldn't leave anyone behind. With the fire spreading faster, he ran toward the building, his bare feet touching the hot ground, his mind focused on one thing: saving more lives. The people at the windows were desperate, but he didn't care about the risk. He didn't think about what might happen to him. The only thought dominating his mind was saving those still there, as he had always dreamed, to be someone who could make a difference. He climbed, once again, up an emergency staircase that was slowly disintegrating, the hot metal burning his hands. His vision was blurred by the smoke, but he didn't stop. When he reached the burning floor, he saw a group of people trapped, some already fallen, others trying to shield themselves from the intense heat. Without hesitation, he guided them to the windows, helping them escape, doing everything possible to get them to safety. He no longer thought of himself. Every life saved, every relieved face, was a victory for him. A victory over the humiliating words that had scarred him, a victory over his own pain. But then, amidst the whirlwind of people, he saw her, the woman who had humiliated him on the street. She was there, paralyzed, pinned to the top-floor window, a look of despair etched on her face. She, who in the not-so-distant past had treated him as if he were nothing, was now there, desperate, in need of someone's help. The boy looked at her for a moment, his eyes meeting hers, and in that instant, a wave of mixed emotions washed over him. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened between them. But something inside him told him that now was not the time to remember those cruel words. It was the time to act. Without hesitation, the boy reached out. He wasn't there for revenge, to exact justice for the words that had tried to destroy him. He was there to save lives, because deep down, he knew no one deserved to die that way, not even those who had treated him like trash. He helped her out the window, with unexpected strength, and guided her to safety, where the firefighters were finally able to rescue her. The city, now stunned, began to realize that the boy who had always been invisible, the one who had spent his entire life in the shadows, had become the hero of this tragedy. He didn't care about the surprised looks or the murmurs of disbelief. He had already achieved what truly mattered, his own dignity and courage. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. What he had done was greater than any recognition. He had overcome the pain, the humiliation, and become the person he always deserved to be, even without knowing it before. The fire still consumed the building, but the city knew that as long as the boy continued to act, as long as he continued to fight, there was a chance. A chance for everyone, not just him. He had become living proof that no matter how much the world tries to crush us, no matter how much cruel words try to define who we are, there is still something within us that can make us overcome any obstacle. And in that moment, the boy found something he had never imagined. He found his place in the world. He was no longer invisible, despised, street trash. He was the hero, the one who showed everyone that even the darkest shadows can be overcome with courage and compassion. As the city began to breathe again, the boy walked away from the fire, sirens still echoing in the distance. The fire was finally under control, but inside him, something still burned brightly. He was exhausted, his muscles aching, and his body dirty from the flames and smoke, but there was something in his eyes no one would ever expect to see in a street kid: peace. He was no longer oppressed by the pain of the past. He was no longer broken. He had found redemption, and that was all he needed. The city was beginning to realize what had happened. The boy, the street trash, had become the hero of the city's greatest tragedy. But as he walked away from the scene of destruction, something unexpected happened. A journalist, who was on the scene covering the fire, approached him. She seemed surprised, but at the same time, there was something in her eyes, something that betrayed curiosity. You were the one who saved the people inside, weren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling, still shocked by what she had just witnessed. The boy, who had been ignored so many times before, now found someone paying attention to him, but he didn't respond immediately. He was far away, lost in his own thoughts. But the journalist, sensing his reluctance, insisted, "I saw you. You didn't hesitate. Why did you do that? You didn't even know if you would make it out alive." The boy looked at her, his eyes, though tired, now filled with immense calm, fixed on the reporter. He could have said many things in that moment. He could have talked about the suffering he'd endured, about the pain of humiliation that had plagued him for so long. He could have mentioned revenge, or perhaps the relief of finally being seen. But he did none of these things. He simply looked at the woman and, in a calm but meaningful tone, replied, "I'm not who you think I am anymore. I never was. Life isn't about what others say about you, it's about who you choose to be. I chose to be someone who makes a difference. Even though no one believed in me, I always knew there was more to me. And today, I proved it." The journalist, still in shock, walked away, but not before giving him a look of respect, something he never imagined he would receive. People began to understand what he truly meant. Not because he had been the hero that day, but because he had shown himself to be more than anyone imagined. The boy had become a symbol of overcoming, not only for those present, but for everyone who saw him. His transformation was not just external, but internal. And as the city reeled from the tragedy, the boy walked away from the spotlight, not expecting recognition, not seeking applause. He knew his true redemption had already happened. He had rescued himself from pain, humiliation, and shame. He knew he was no longer that invisible boy, the one always left behind. He was someone who, in a moment of crisis, became the change the world needed. That night, as the city lights twinkled in the distance, he sat on a random bench, gazing up at the stars. The city was still healing its wounds, but he had already found his peace. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He knew that, deep down, the greatest transformation had taken place within himself. The boy no longer needed the harsh words of the past to define himself. He knew that every step he took brought him closer to his true essence. He was no longer a passive spectator of his own life, but an active protagonist, determined to write his own destiny. He was no longer street trash. He was living proof that, no matter how much life tries to crush our hope, true strength lies in our ability to overcome. As the boy walked the streets that had once rejected him, he realized he no longer felt the weight of humiliation. The city, which had once closed its doors to him, was now merely a stage where he had performed the greatest act of his life. He knew the battle was not over, that the world could still try to destroy him, but within him lay something no one could ever take away: his dignity and the certainty that he was capable of reinventing himself, of being more than any label society might impose on him. Life, for him, was no longer about the struggle for survival, but about the struggle for self-improvement. Each day was a new opportunity to prove to himself that, regardless of how the world saw him, he could be whatever he wanted. He was no longer searching for acceptance, because he had finally accepted himself. And now, as he looked to the future, he knew there were no limits to what he could achieve. And so it was that the boy, once considered invisible, became the greatest hero of his own story. He didn't need the words of those who humiliated him, nor the approval of those who ignored him. He had found, within himself, the strength to be everything he was always meant to be. And that, he knew, was more than enough. Because, in the end, saving a life is saving an entire world.